So thank you, everyone. This is the November 3rd community conversation for the Uptown area. There was a conversation around this particular area at noon, and now this is the evening one. We have very small participation, so I think it's a more intimate conversation. And virtual meeting guidelines, which we're all very familiar with, and I don't think we have anyone on the phone, which is kind of the biggest thing, is that some of the tools that we use to gather information are not really that friendly on the phone, but that's not an issue in this particular case. So typically we have an informational meeting overview and talk about what the policy map is and how it relates to the streets map and what the streets map is, how the two maps relate to one another, and then what are the two draft maps. I think in this particular situation, we can kind of hurry through that to some extent because the folks we have on the call are familiar with that. And then moving into the community conversation piece, so it's like a 1 and 2 part piece. The second part being reviewing the 2040 policy map recommendations, discussing additional steps for the mapping approach and any adjustments that would be recommended. So for the informational piece, I think that the folks on this call are very familiar with the fact that the plan was adopted in June. We are now working on supporting initiatives to implement the plan. Tonight, the main focus is on the policy map. We'll also touch on the Charlotte Streets map, which focuses on mobility and directly relates to the policy map, and also the Unified Development Ordinance, which is also a separate process, but does relate to the policy map. And so when we talk about, the relationship between the two maps. So Charlotte over the past 20 years has really focused on connecting land use and transportation. And in doing so, recognizing that there are connections between street facilities and streetscapes. I thought this had some pieces that faded in, but maybe not. Streets and the land uses that they support. So that's the basic relationship between the two maps. So the policy map really informs how the streets map functions to some extent, in that we want to relate the land use or the place type to the type of street that it is accessible off of, or directly fronts, or all of those types of things. And so the two draft maps we're talking about are the streets map and the policy map. When we talk about streets, just to touch on that, what are we talking about? What makes up a street? And if you can look at this cross section here, which is if you looked up a street and then kind of cut it in half and looked at what all the elements are, moving left to right. The first is the center space, which can be different things. In this case, you see turn lanes and planting strips, or also pedestrian refuges. Those aren't present on every single street, but when they are, that's what can happen in that space. B is the travel lanes, which we're all probably most familiar with and which every street contains. C is bicycle facilities, which not every street does contain, but if there is room, this is where this particular function can happen. D is curb and gutter, which is sometimes ignored, but is a very integral piece of streets. E is the amenity zone, which can be a planting strip, and sometimes there's parking there. And then F is pedestrian facilities, so your sidewalks and those kinds of things. So the streets map, which you can view, and there'll be a link to this a little bit further on in the presentation. You can take a look at it on the online mapping tool, is really the mapped vision for our multimodal street network. And it's a key implementation tool for not only the policy map for the Unified Development Ordinance as well. And it shows the expected cross-section for all arterials, so kind of your more heavily traveled streets. And that would include what type of street it is, the street classification, how many lanes would it be, and if there are bike facilities recommended as part of that. I mentioned the online mapping tool. That's an interactive map that includes cross-section details for all arterial streets, and you can click on the street and a pop-out box will come out depending on the location that you click on that particular street. It will describe all the aspects of that street, and then you'll be able to comment on it as well. And if this is a little bit complex, there's a demonstration video also that's available, and the address for that is down in the right-hand corner. So when we talk about the streets map, the policy map, it's basically a translation of policies that we have had in place as far as future land use goes into place type. So more of place types really are place-based policies for specific geographies that contain more information than a typical land use recommendation would. So a land use recommendation would be sort of more of your two-dimensional, what kind of use is it? It wouldn't tell you much more than that. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the future, but in further slides. But place types really talk more about also form of the development that you can expect in a particular area. And it also provides direction for balancing future needs and opportunities. So the comprehensive plan policies, and again, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but are really focused on balancing all the dimensions of growth that our community is. So we have expected growth that we will be accepting over the next 20 years, and sort of balancing the needs and opportunities that come with growth, and protecting priorities in certain policies while also providing for that opportunity for growth, also aligning future growth with our infrastructure needs and capacity, and improving access to underserved areas. Oops, not too far. So we talk about the place type tool, and it was developed, the mapping approach was developed using a 3-step process. So first we mapped existing development, so kind of what's on the ground today, and that's just kind of a reference tool. And then we mapped our adopted policies. So we have adopted land use policies for virtually every part of the city and the portions of the county that are in our influence area. So mapping all of those, and then using that information and layering upon it the Charlotte Future 2040 policies to create the Charlotte Future 2040 map. And as I mentioned, place types are really just a new tool that we're using, new to our community. It's been around in the planning spectrum for quite a number of years, but it really gives the mix and proportion of land use, the building form and design, how you can expect to access those uses, what the parking requirements might be, and then how it relates to open space. So it really gives a lot more information about what type of development can be expected in a particular area, and provides more certainty around what future development might look like for both the community and for the community that lives in that particular area, and also the development community. So we talk about place types, and in the past, we've had over 80 something land use categories that really, again, did not tell you much more than what the expected use might be for a particular area. Place types, again, builds in that form component. And we've grouped those into 3 different categories: work, live, and play. And so they're fairly self-explanatory in terms of live. You'd find, your residential and multifamily neighborhoods, and also layering into that a separate component of parks and preserves. And then smaller parks would really be built into the neighborhood 1 and 2 category. Work, the different components of that would be commercial, campus, light industrial, mixed use, and manufacturing and logistics. And then play, in terms of thinking about where do you go for, recreation, shopping, all of those different things. So we've categorized those as centers. There's a neighborhood center, which is smaller and serves a very immediate area, the community activity center, which might have a larger draw, and then regional activity center, which has a very large draw. And again, in developing the policy map, there was a 3-step process. The first, as I mentioned earlier, was mapping existing development. So using existing land use in the form of development. And this is a reference map. It doesn't feed into any of the other 2 maps, but it's really just kind of okay, let's take stock of what's on the ground today. Adopted policy, so using future land use. So any future land use plans that were adopted 2010 or later. And that's about 30% of the community. And where that guidance doesn't exist, then relying on zoning. And then where the zoning translation isn't that easy to do, building in the market support sector of it. Then we take that information from the adopted policies and layer in the Charlotte Future 2040 policies, especially in terms of the equitable growth framework, mappable plan policies that are more place-based, and then survey responses from the surveys that we had out in phase 1. As checks, we used growth projections, infrastructure and environmental capacity information, and then market feasibility. So how certain is it that this type of development could occur in this particular area? So the policy map really focuses on the entire city and portions of the county that are not already in other jurisdictions. And that's a huge geography. It's 350 something square miles or something like that. So in order to kind of like break it down into manageable chunks, we broke it into 15 sub-planning areas. And tonight, the area we're focusing on is Uptown. So Uptown is unique. The boundaries of it are roughly 277 and 77. And also, unlike the other planning areas, or most of the other planning areas, it really has a strong network and planned a network of high capacity transit. So that's a huge influence in this area as well. So if we looked at existing development and adopted policies, so if you look at existing land use for this particular area, it's almost kind of homogeneous in that really Uptown is the ultimate regional activity center that you would want to have anywhere for that type of development, because it really has access, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in future slides. It has a variety of mobility options, and it has access to all the different services, goods and services and employment and all those different things that you would want to have. So from an existing perspective, in the form of development really is probably the most intense and the most self-sufficient of any in Charlotte. So you can see,
to clarify real quick, this is translating the existing land use into the categories, into the place categories.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Clint. So it's basically, if we took what's on the ground and translated it into a place type, that's all this is saying. And it doesn't inform any of the other maps that we have. So it's just kind of like a reference tool, if that makes sense. The next is taking adoptive policies. So our adoptive future land use policies, translating those into place types where that particular guidance doesn't exist because it was 2010 and on, then using zoning as a tool, and where zoning wasn't kind of like a fairly direct translation into a place type, using, market feasibility as a component to help with that. So this piece is like, if we translated all of that and didn't do anything else, here's what we would have. And you can see with the percentages, kind of some of them go down. Neighborhood 1 goes down, Parks and Rec goes down, campus goes down, the centers go way up, and neighborhood 2 increases as well. So a lot of this, as we'll see on the next map, is really much of the uses that you see decreasing get absorbed into the centers. And again, the centers can accept a whole lot of different types of uses. Oops. So when we took that information and then layered in the Charlotte Future policies, primarily the Charlotte Future Equitable Growth Framework, which is very new to us. So again, looking at how do we equitably disperse the challenges and the benefits that come from growth and development, plan policies, and specifically around preserving neighborhood 1, manufacturing and logistics, and a few other things I'll talk about in a minute, and then survey responses from phase 1. And then as checks, we used growth projections, infrastructure and environmental capacity. So we don't want to be increasing growth in areas that it can't be supported from an environmental and infrastructure capacity perspective. And then also market feasibility. So how likely is this to happen over the next 20 years in this particular area? So when we look at the preservation policies, the first kind of bucket of those is preserving existing single family areas, and then also manufacturing and logistics and parks and preserves. So these are kind of preservation policies or protection policies that bubbled up throughout the development of the comprehensive plan. And for this particular area, you can see that neighborhood 1 increased. So I think that's really calling that out differently than it has been in previous plans. And then manufacturing and logistics gets absorbed into the centers, the regional activity center, and then parks and preserves. And really here you're looking at, in addition to parks that exist, but the Elmwood Cemetery as well, because that's a county-owned space.
Is there a scale of determining whether or not an area or place is designated a park, as opposed to, like, Romare Bearden doesn't pop in this, but it's obviously within a regional activity center, versus Pinewood Elmwood, obviously very different. So, like,
Yeah, so there's an acreage threshold for that,
Okay.
and it's 10 acres. And really, parks are considered secondary uses in most every place type.
Right.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, you know, those are components of neighborhoods and other place types. The only instance in where we call them out is if they're 10 acres or larger. So I don't remember what the acreage of Mayor Bearden is, but I don't think it's quite at that level.
Yeah, like 5-ish.
Yeah. So again, if that's something that when we move on and kind of have the community conversation piece of this, if you think that's something that we need to change our thinking on, we're completely open to hearing that.
Hey, Kathy, it's Kiba. Thank you for that additional context, because I think I missed that memo in our previous sessions here.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how many other people are thinking, hey, we don't have enough park and preserve or open space, because that's exactly how I interpreted it. So I wonder, you know, what the thought process is, if that information hadn't previously been shared about that threshold. I would be thinking, and I was up until this point, that we were missing a lot of park and preserve space in this particular geographic area.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, Kiba, because I think that we haven't consistently shared that, but what I would say, and we can definitely bring this to the forefront if we need to, is that most of the place types have, well, basically all of them have primary uses, but they're secondary uses. And for you, I think this will resonate even more in that, for example, in a neighborhood, there might be a small park, schools, churches that are all components of a neighborhood. The way we do it today, where we call them out as individual land uses, makes it a little bit inconvenient in terms of, for example, when you're doing a mandatory referral or something like that, that it doesn't recognize that because it's calling it out as a specific land use. So the place type has all of those uses as kind of secondary components. So recognizing that, you know, they are part of what makes that particular place type. So the only reason that we call out individually, for example, parks and preserves over a certain size is because there will be a zoning district that ties to those in the new zoning ordinance for the larger parks and preserves.
No question. Do we have a count or percentage? What percentage of our parks are over 10 acres? What percentage actually meets that 10-acre threshold? Do we have that data?
I don't have that off the top of my head, but we can certainly let you know that. And we have also kind of checked this with Park and Rec, because those are kind of, they have tiering for their parks, and I can't remember all the names of them off the top of my head either, but the 10-acre plus kind of meets kind of their larger park size, if that makes, not the more kind of neighborhood focused parks. But we can certainly get that information for you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I talked about the equitable growth framework, and I'm sorry, I keep doing this, but so that measures access to different goods and services, which is not that different from what we've done in the past, but we are measuring it in a different way. So access to housing opportunity, goods and services, and employment. Those are things that we've measured in the past as part of our like kind of larger scale policies. But the difference is measuring them in terms of, okay, so if there is access to housing opportunity or goods and services or employment, that scores higher for an increase in intensity, as opposed to what we're doing in this plan is kind of spreading those access things, recognizing where those don't exist and trying to improve access to those particular elements. What we have not measured in the past is environmental justice. So let's look at each of those in a little bit more detail. So for Uptown, access to housing. So when we talk about access to housing, we talk about housing unit diversity, cost, size, subsidized housing, tenure, and level of reinvestment. From a place type perspective, what can really be addressed is housing unit diversity. And so in these maps, anything that is outside of this hatched area or this kind of shaded area is considered not having access to housing or goods and services or employment. And I think what you'll see here is that Uptown accessibility to these things is not an issue at all. Now, you know, cost and those types of things, you know, could be, and that's outside of the realm of what we're doing in this plan and in this mapping effort. But it really, I would again say that Uptown really is kind of, again, the ultimate regional activity center. Place types that can increase access to housing opportunity would be neighborhood 2, community activity center, and regional. And, you know, as we've talked about, those are all present here. So there's not really an issue with this particular measure. Where we do see, you know, some gaps is in terms of environmental justice. So when you look at environmental justice, we look at tree canopy, impervious surface, proximity to heavy industrial uses, major transportation infrastructure, and floodplains. And the last 3 are the ones that really can be addressed through the place type effort. Really in Uptown, it's the proximity to the highways. Mm-hmm. And from a place type perspective, the way you would maybe mitigate that is buffering neighborhoods from heavy industrial uses, from infrastructure, and not mapping more intense place types in the floodplain. However, really the one that applies most here that we've talked about is major transportation infrastructure. But Uptown is so built out that it's very difficult to provide those buffering measures. So in this particular instance, we would have to rely on, you know, all of these things from an equitable growth framework, not just place types can help mitigate it. It's kind of a multi-dimensional effort. And so there would have to be other projects and programs, for example, design solutions, other infrastructure projects, other capital investments that would need to be made to help mitigate these issues in terms of environmental justice.
Yeah, because you're right. We really don't, you know, major industrial activity, one of them is on the way out and the other one seems to be in a permanent state of flux. You know, sometimes they think about it, sometimes they don't, and sometimes they're just quiet. So yeah, you're exactly right. Mm-hmm. Is there any overlap with, you know, again, our creek systems kind of run just on the fringes of Uptown,
right?
But, you know, outside of that kind of Cedar Yards sink over in the west or over in Third Ward, you know, is there any significant portion of Uptown beyond that really at floodplain risk?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think from the environmental justice perspective, it's really the relationship to the highways.
Right.
And I think,
is any of mass transit, like any either streetcar or light rail, considered a part of, you know, major infrastructure?
Yeah,
yeah. When it comes to the territory of being up here at this point, honestly, if you're electing to live in Uptown, you're accepting a certain degree of noise, activity, etc. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, so those are components as well. And, you know, so buffering from those where you can, but I think some of those, I mean, you know, just as an aside, I think as part of those projects, when they're constructed from a noise perspective, there is kind of some work that's done, you know, for example, with bells or whatever, and those kinds of things that happen with the adjacent land uses. So I don't know, outside of what's already being done, what more could be done, I guess you'd say.
Right.
But if we look at the 2040 policy map, layering all those pieces together at one time, this is what you get. And again, it's predominantly a regional activity center, and then recognizing some of the neighborhood 2 more where it's predominantly neighborhood 2, and then also the small pockets of neighborhood 1, and then the parks and preserve that we've discussed.
Can you speak a little bit to, I'm looking in again in the 3rd Ward area, there's that kind of community activity transition zone there between what looks like Moorhead and probably First Street.
Yeah.
Is there a reason that's considered there, but not necessarily, you know, I'm thinking of like the 7th Street corridor border around First Ward, or, you know, I'm not fighting for it or against it, just wondering like if that, what the consideration was there versus kind of some of those other buffer zones. Was it just that's largely undeveloped versus the other, you know, 1st and 4th Ward have pretty tight developed edges, whereas that's kind of, it's not empty. There's certainly some adaptive reuse potential over there, but was that more or less the delineator?
Yeah, so that's a great comment, because this is a data-driven process, and it's kind of a methodical process. So again, it would, in order to map those areas, it would look at adopted land use policy, and where that is not meeting the threshold of 2010 or beyond, then it would look at existing zoning entitlements. And then where that's a little bit sketchy, it would pull in the market perspective. So I think for that community activity center, all of those things are in play there. If you think that that may not be exactly accurate, you know, we can definitely look at what was pulled into there to come up with that recommendation. I think the major thing for this mapping effort is kind of getting folks to realize that the approach or the methodology for the mapping is citywide, not
right. Parcel by parcel,
or even yeah, and parcel wise, which is very different than what we've done in the past. But that said, where there are areas that seem like something could be off, and there have been quite a few, we're happy to go in and look at it. So if you think that that may be not appropriate in that particular location, we're happy to look at what went into pulling in that particular place type for that area.
Well, I mean, I think it's appropriate. And it, again, kind of thinking back to the context of like center city plan wise, we definitely talk about that exact area as kind of that transition zone between what could ultimately happen at the pipe and foundry site and then that existing. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit of mixed density, but a lot of single family still over there. But, you know, it's kind of sort of changing. But yeah, no, that makes total sense.
Okay. So growth allocations, a big piece of this is, you know, Charlotte is expected to, over the next 20 years, grow by 150,000 something households and 200,000 jobs. So of that large piece in Uptown, the area that we're looking at right now is expected to accept about 6% of the housing growth or over the next 20 years. And even larger than that is, you know, almost half of the jobs in the area are expected to go into Uptown. So a large part of this is also, we know this growth is coming, and this is what our growth projections tell us. So how can we accommodate this growth? So a large piece of this map is also thinking about those components. So that was kind of an overview of the mapping process. So now this is really the community conversation piece. Community conversation, I guess, of one. So again, adjustments to the mapping approach. And, you know, again, I think that you're familiar with this. What the type of feedback we're talking about is really that which would be citywide. So what additional steps might be added to the mapping approach to better align it with the goals in the comprehensive plan? And are there any adjustments that need to be made? And again, like we just talked about a couple minutes ago, this isn't parcel specific edits, but more adjustments to steps in the overall approach that will be applied citywide. And so in these conversations, we've really been asking 3 different questions, but for Uptown, honestly, really only one of those applies in this particular area. So, and even that is a little bit skewed. So there are a lot of large lot single family neighborhoods on major transportation corridors in the city. And I would maybe put some of that in quotation marks for this particular area. So these areas could evolve into neighborhood 2, which is more intense residential development to provide more housing options in the future. So the question is really, in the plan, there are policies that protect existing single family neighborhoods. So is it more important to protect those, or is it more important maybe to provide more housing options along major corridors in the city? And we have a poll to do this, Clint, but I don't know if you want to just tell us. That might be easier. Sorry, Maria or Ren, whoever's doing the polling.
No worries.
I think we can just have a conversation about it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm, again, because of the nature of the area we're talking about, I'm definitely going to be leaning more towards, you know, getting more options, getting more housing opportunities up here. Certainly, it's we don't want to see any more single family within Uptown. Not that I think anyone's thinking that, you know, these days anyway, but I do have a question relative to neighborhood 2. And, you know, my understanding from the place types is that there are certain commercial uses or non-residential uses permitted in neighborhood 2 that are not in neighborhood 1. And my question really was determining the location of those. Is that really what's tied to the streets mapping process? And so, you know, we're not saying, you know, this whole 10 block area, let's say, is zone neighborhood 2, you know, not entirely appropriate for a commercial use smack in the center of it, but on that transition zone or whatever that street category is between those two, that makes complete sense. And so that was kind of my real question is, you know, what does the opportunity look like for neighborhood commercial space within these districts or within this place type? And where is it tied to streets? Like, is that the primary determinant within this place?
Yeah, that's definitely a large piece of it for neighborhood 2. And I would mention too, obviously in a regional activity center, both of those components are expected or at play. But yes, for neighborhood 2, a large part of it is the accessibility off of certain type of street facilities. And that link between the street maps is pretty important there.
What, if any, bearing does historic districts play on this just with regard to Fourth Ward. I'm wondering if, obviously there's a whole host of restrictions relative to development within those areas. And so I didn't know if there was a density component of that existing within historic district policy now. I think on the map, all of Fourth Ward is neighborhood 2. Totally makes sense. It does already have that mixture of uses and densities of housing. But I didn't know if there was kind of like a default just because of the presence of a historic district, or if that, that's kind of a whole nother level of policy implication for developing in that area that this doesn't really touch.
Yeah, so the historic districts kind of are an overlay district onto whatever the particular area is zoned. And it really kind of looks to the land use policy for the density recommendations of it, if that makes sense. So all of those restrictions are in the regulatory piece, but then it turns to land use policy and the zoning, the underlying zoning for what the density is. I don't think that's any different in the way, the UDO draft was released earlier in October 7th or something like that. I don't think it's any different there. However, we have heard as part of these community conversations, several folks have mentioned kind of layering in that historic component in a different way. So I think that's something that we'll definitely be looking at.
Well, yeah, that was going to be kind of my next question to that is like, I'm imagining there's already been a spike of requests for designation just in response to doing something different, period. Like I would imagine, but I think this is probably of the 6 current ones, this is probably the only one that isn't in one. I would imagine maybe Dilworth somewhat has a little bit of nuance there, but okay, now that makes sense. That totally makes sense.
So the next piece would be, and again, we can probably kind of fly through this a little bit easier, or we can do it this way if you want. The way we've been doing it, Clint, is that you would use the annotate tool to kind of stamp areas that you want to have more conversation about, or where you think something might look weird or those kinds of things. But I think since it's such a small group here, if you want it, we can just have this conversation. Is there any area that you see on this map that you think you'd have more questions about, or maybe we want to make some adjustments made, or all of those kinds of things?
Not really. I mean, beyond kind of the items we've already been discussing. Again, obviously this is such a different context than I'm sure any of these other conversations you are having to have around the rest of the city. So
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So all that said, we've been doing these conversations for a couple of weeks now, and next week we're kind of wrapping it up. These have all been online, but we will have in-person office hours, and we've released those dates. I think, Maria, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think they're like the 16th through the 19th or something like that.
Yeah, the 16th through November 16th through the 18th, and we'll be at a few different libraries and at the government center. And yeah, that's on our website now. Yeah,
and we have hard copies of. We have an online comment tool, which I really didn't go over that much, but I think you're aware of that. We have an online comment tool, and then which has been pretty well used, but for those who aren't comfortable with it, we also have hard copies of the comment form that are available at libraries and YMCAs. And then what we're using, the feedback that we're getting from these meetings, this is a draft map. I should have, obviously highlighted that earlier on. but it is kind of our first draft to kind of start this conversation. We're using all the information that we're gathering from these conversations to figure out what are the adjustments that need to be made, and then we'll release another second draft at the end of the year, early 2022. And it'll probably be closer to early 2022. So that's really all we have, Clint. I don't know if you have any other questions or comments.
Not really. I mean, I really appreciate it. Any chance to get smarter about this stuff for sure. But no, this is great. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good seeing you, Clint.